Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Anthony, and with me I have Ben and Tom. And the three of us here are excited to bring you today's topic on the power of governance, in which we're going to be talking about best practices, tips, and tricks, and tooling that you can leverage to make sure that your Power Platform deployment or implementation is as secure and compliant as it can possibly be. Now, before we get into the content today, I do have a couple of housekeeping items I want to cover with the group in terms of how today's webinar is going to work. First and foremost, you'll probably notice that this is not a one-to-one event. Rather, this is being made available to multiple Microsoft customers. Well, what does that mean for you? That means things like your name, your email address, your avatar could be visible to other people within the webinar. If you aren't comfortable with that, please feel free to drop now and we could schedule a more individual conversation by working with your business applications sales specialist. Next here, today's session is being recorded, so if you would like to review this after today's live session, please reach out to that business applications sales specialist and they will send you a recording link for today's session for you to consume later and share with colleagues. Lastly here, talk about getting questions answered. You likely see that things like your microphone, your camera, or the meeting chat is disabled. If you look in your top navigation, we're going to be leveraging the Teams Q&A feature where we have a live panel there who are going to be answering questions as they come in. So please feel free to leverage that Q&A feature to get questions answered as we're going through the course of today's material. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the presentation. Now, before we dive too deep, I do want to take a minute just talking a little bit about the fundamentals of Power Platform governance, because we know that we hear a lot from our customers and some concerns that they have around governing the Power Platform and security and compliance that really keep them awake at night. And when we're speaking to our customers, and usually within the IT groups at the customers that we speak with, there's three major areas of concern that come up more often than not. And first and foremost, and probably the most common concern we hear about, is data exfiltration. So that question of how can we ensure that our sensitive company data doesn't leave our system, right? And if we drill down into that just one level deeper, there's two major areas of the platform that cause this concern around data exfiltration. One being connectors, and connectors are what make the Power Platform great, in my opinion and a lot of others, that over 900 pre-built connectors that we have within the Power Platform that have thousands of pre-built triggers and actions. But the question is how to manage what data goes where with the ability to connect to that many external sources. And it's a great question and a seriously valid concern. The other here is email. So that simple question of how do we ensure that sensitive data doesn't get distributed through, let's say, Outlook or another email provider. Now, the second big concern that we hear about is, let's say, somebody creating an app or a flow with premium functionality without understanding the potential licensing consequences or implications of that. And then further, we have customers fear the downstream effects of licensing implications of, let's say, the same user sharing that premium app or flow with others in the organization, who of course would also have to be licensed to consume that app or flow. And then third here, we generally hear some overall anxiety around app sprawl. So think of that as an app that starts as a simple productivity app that the owner then distributes to larger teams or even potentially across the organization. And the question around that is, how can you maintain control of an app or flow that's shared widespread? And then also in that same context, what about apps or flows that are being created and never being touched again? Because the reality is that these take up space and become more and more difficult to manage while Power Platform adoption grows. So, in all, with the absence of a solid governance strategy, most IT teams, they hear about the Power Platform or notice some organic growth within the organization and straight away call for it to be completely shut down. Because again, that idea of citizen developers or business users creating applications or workflows and not having complete control and management over those assets would really make anyone in IT pause to evaluate how everything within the platform is being designed and distributed. Now, meanwhile, on the flip side, the business usually embraces tools like the Power Platform, and they feel like they need it to build out things that are important to getting more work done efficiently. And what that drives is essentially this, let's say, arm wrestling match between IT and the business. And really what we're trying to get to today with this webinar is that we want to set a great foundation for what strong Power Platform governance can look like. In turn, with the hope that that arm wrestling match can then turn into a handshake. So let's step back and start at one of the most fundamentals of Power Platform governance, which is environments and establishing an environment strategy. Now, when you think about environments, it's sometimes easier to think about what kinds of apps or flows that your users want to build within the Power Platform. For instance, if they're simply looking to create Office 365 productivity applications or flows, the best place to create is usually within the default environment. This environment is actually specifically tuned to handle Office 365 applications within the Power Platform. So that's using things like SharePoint or OneDrive or Outlook. Now, in fact, you'll probably notice that when you first launch the Power Platform, you have access to the default environment right away to start building within. Because what happens is that default environment is provisioned as soon as your Microsoft tenant is created. One thing I want to note here is that your tenant will only have one default environment that all users can create within. Now, earlier we talked about the 900 plus connectors available within the Power Platform, and chances are you want to build some great tools using some of those connectors. That's where business application environments come into play, because these environments are specifically set up for areas of the business that need the added functionality of the Power Platform that is not available within the default environment. In fact, this is where you can also start leveraging the rich data platform capabilities of Dataverse. Now, for business applications, we use environments that we describe as non-default environments. And you can have as many non-default environments as you need, so long as you meet the single requirement of having at least 1 gigabyte of available space to provision that said environment. Now, that storage is either procured through entitlements with premium Power Platform licenses or by purchasing standalone additional storage. And lastly, there's a concept of a Teams environment. And a Teams environment is used when there are going to be apps and flows that are built within Microsoft Teams to be consumed within Microsoft Teams. So it's almost in a container there. Now, Teams environments will also include what we call Dataverse for Teams, which is essentially just a little less robust version of the full Dataverse capabilities you'd use in a business applications environment. Now, Teams applications use what we call Dataverse for Teams environments. And you can generally have about 1 Dataverse for Teams environment for every 20 users in your organization. The number of Dataverse for Teams environments you can provision will be tapped out by the number of users within your tenant versus the storage used for the default and non-default environments that we talked about previously. So, one of the first questions that you'll get from your business users is where they should build their apps or flows. And generally, if these are personal productivity assets using, let's say, Office 365 connectors, they should be built within the default environment. 1, it's easy to get to. 2, very easy to access. Everyone within the organization with a Power Platform entitlement has access to the default environment. For simple business use cases, users can continue to use the default environment, but can also consider a non-default or Dataverse for Teams environment to use more of the data platform capabilities of Dataverse. And then as apps and flows become more complex or business critical, you'll want to leverage business application environments or non-default environments to take full advantage of Dataverse and everything that has to offer. Now, there are a number of requirements to get started on truly embracing governance for the Power Platform. 1, you'll need a global tenant administrator to assign permissions for the Power Platform. You'll also need some Power Platform administrator accounts to create and manage the environments and policies within the Power Platform. Then, you'll want a Teams administrator permission to manage those Dataverse for Teams environments we previously talked about. The remaining items here are specific to the Center of Excellence Starter Kit, which we've developed as a great framework tool for standing up governance in the platform, and we'll delve into much deeper later in the webinar here. But for that, you'll want Office Security and Compliance log read permissions to set up audit logs, which will give an administrator information on how apps and flows are being built and consumed by your users. Then we also recommend at least 2 per user licenses, because these licenses give you full access to the Power Platform and are essential to setting up the Center of Excellence Starter Kit. You're also going to need 1 per flow license to ensure that the flows in that starter kit are going to run properly. And then you'll need a copy, of course, of that COE starter kit. And lastly here, you'll want security groups to control access to environments. So now what we've covered is that high-level conversation around the fundamentals of Power Platform governance. We talked about major IT concerns that we hear from a majority of our customers. We talked about environments and different environment types and where users should be building based on the types of apps and flows that they're looking to create. And then lastly, we talked about some prerequisites for getting started with establishing your governance foundation for the Power Platform. Next, let's jump into securing the default environment. So now we've established what the default environment is, and really when you're starting to think about putting your governance plan into practice, one of the very first places you want to start is in that default environment and putting some guardrails and things in place that are going to secure that default environment. The reason that I say that is because we talked earlier that the default environment is established when the very first license is assigned to your Microsoft tenant that includes any sort of entitlements to Power Platform. Yes, that includes things like M365 and Office 365. So very well, for a lot of our customers, this default environment is created the very first time they procure their first Microsoft license. Which is really great because, again, we intend on this default environment being this personal productivity environment, giving people a place to go to create Power Apps and Power Automate flows and use their imagination a bit with the licenses or entitlements that they have. Because when a new user is added to your Microsoft tenant and gets any one of those licenses, they become what we call an environment maker in the default environment, which simply just means that they can come in and create apps and flows. Again, this is supposed to be a good thing, a productivity environment, a place people can go to build. But that said, for those of us that need to consider things like security and compliance and governance, there are some things that we need to put in place in this environment to make sure that we are protecting company data and that people are creating apps and flows that are in accordance with the policies that we've put in place. So let's jump into a couple of those things here. So we'll jump into these a little bit more in depth in a demo environment, but I do just want to talk about a quick list of hot topic items that you might want to consider in terms of securing your default environment. First and foremost here, the concept of limiting environment creation. Now, we covered a little bit earlier the different types of environments that are out there in the Power Platform. Ben is going to be taking us later through implementing an environment strategy. But when we're talking about securing the default environment, that might even start with limiting users' ability to create their own new environments, rather driving them to the default environment. Because if they can create their own, they can do things like create their own security and create their own policies. And we want them to be leveraging the company policies we've put in place in the default environment. Next here, the idea of admin selection and assignment. So very likely that Power Platform administration is not a one-person job. So how do you find other administrators out there, and how do you make sure that they have the right assignments to be able to co-lead or co-administer the Power Platform with you? Next, we're going to be talking about checking capacity that's pooled across your tenant to make sure that certain environments aren't eating up too much of that capacity and you're staying within the bounds of what you've purchased capacity-wise for the Power Platform. Next, we'll talk about a default data loss prevention policy that you can set against the default environment. We'll get into this a little bit more, but data loss prevention policies is essentially a way that you can limit the connectors that can be used in conjunction with one another or completely block connectors. And that's a big thing that we're talking about doing in the default environment. And lastly, here we'll talk just very briefly about limiting sharing. So making sure that users don't do things like share an app or a flow across the entire organization. And Tom will be getting into that a little bit later in our managed environment section. So you'll be getting a little bit more on there. But for the first couple that we talked about here, let's jump into a demo environment where we can talk a little bit more about each and actually show you how to configure most of those steps here. So let's jump in. Okay, so here I am now inside the Power Platform Admin Center. Those Power Platform administrators out here today are probably very familiar with this Admin Center, as it's where you do a majority of your work in terms of governing and administering the Power Platform. But for our first strategy we talked about here, this is where we're going to land, that idea of limiting who can create new environments. Now, from the Power Platform Admin Center in your left navigation here, you have this area for settings. And if you drop into settings, this is going to be all the tenant settings that you can set up across the entire tenant. Ben will be getting into some of these later when we talk about securing the tenant. But for our purposes here, when we talk about limiting who can create environments, you notice that we have two areas here in these tenant settings: production environment assignments, trial environment assignments. And if you click on either one of those there, you notice the description is who can create and manage production environments. And by default, it's set to everybody. Not a recommendation we have for a majority of our customers. Rather, we recommend coming in here and selecting only specific admins. That way you can decide which administrators have the ability then to create production environments, and it's not opened up to everybody. Now, the same kind of rules would apply for trial environment assignments. If we go down to this next row here, who can create and manage trial environments, also set to everybody. Now, some of our customers will leave this as is. Some of them will say, we want to make sure that Power Platform administrators are the ones going in and creating those trial environments so we can manage capacity, so people don't lose all the great things that they create in that 30-day period when their trial environment expires, and so on and so forth. But as you can see here, the setting is as simple as switching that toggle from everyone to only specific admins if you would like to do so for the trial environments. All right, so now let's talk about identifying and assigning Power Platform administrators. You've probably noticed here that I switched over to the M365 Admin Center. And in our left navigation over here, you're going to be selecting active users. And from this list, we'll see all the active users across our entire M365 tenant. And let's say I've identified somebody like Alan Steiner here, who is generally just a normal user across our tenant, but I want to promote him to a Power Platform administrator. I can click on his name and get into his details and make the change through there. Or rather, even more simply, all I have to do is select the checkbox next to his name here. And you notice in my top navigation, I have this button for Manage Roles. When I select that now, we notice that, as mentioned, Alan is just a user with no Admin Center access. But because I do want to promote him to a Power Platform admin, I'm going to select this option for Admin Center access. And if I scroll down and expand on this Show All by category, it's as simple now as checking the box for Power Platform Administrator. You can see some of the details there. Basically gives them full access to administer the Power Platform. And I click Save Changes at the bottom. And now we've added Alan as a Power Platform administrator. Okay, so now we're back in our Power Platform Admin Center to talk about how you can check capacity across your entire Power Platform tenant. Now in the left navigation, same place where we hit settings before, right below that is this area for resources. And if you drill down on that and select capacity, you are going to be getting your Power Platform capacity report. Now mine will look pretty empty here. I'm working in a demo environment, but you'll likely see that yours has a lot of data in here. Now first and foremost, we're seeing our storage capacity usage. When you first provision your tenant or when you add user licenses to the Power Platform, all of that gets pooled up to the tenant level, and there's 3 different buckets of storage. There's database, there's file, and there's log. And in this area here, you will be seeing on your end how much is consumed versus how much you have available. A lot of our customers say, where does that come from? Where does all this storage capacity come from? And if you look at the next tile on the right-hand side, you'll notice the storage capacity by the source. So you can see again that your org, your tenant, gets a default capacity when it's first provisioned. All the additional capacity that's being pooled up at the tenant level from user licenses, and then any additional capacity that you might purchase directly for storage capacity for the Power Platform. So this is your capacity report here. I will mention, and we're not going to drill too deep into it here, that this is also where you can come in and provision add-ons for your individual environments, whether that be things like AI Builder credits or per app or per flow licenses for the environments. You are going to be adding them in the add-on section right here from your capacity report. All right, so now for the last one here, we're going to talk about creating a data loss prevention policy for the default environment. And I'm going to move rather quickly through this one, just for sake of time, so we could fit in everything from Ben and Tom here. But in our Power Platform Admin Center, you notice we have the drop down for policies on the left-hand side over here, and that button for data policies. This is where you are going to go to create new data loss prevention policies, basically saying what connectors are going to be able to be used within environments, which are blocked, which can communicate with others. Now, if you click New Policy in your top navigation here, it'll simply prompt you to name your policy, and we are going to create one for the default environment. So let's call it Default DLP Policy. And I'm going to click Next. Then you notice here too that we have 3 different buckets for all of the connectors we have built out for Power Platform. There's business, non-business, and blocked. The concept of business versus non-business is that if you have connectors that sit in the business bucket here, they cannot communicate or work in conjunction with connectors that live in this non-business bucket, and works vice versa as well. And then pretty self-explanatory, we have the concept of blocked. Now for the default environment, a good practice we do with a lot of our customers is basically for that default environment, blocking all the connectors that could be blocked until we've had an opportunity to review those, just to protect company data. So the easiest way to do that is from this non-business bucket where you're starting from. Filter on this list here for blockable and look at all the ones that are blockable. There's about 20, 25 of them that can't be blocked that are generally just Microsoft services. But you see, still almost 1,000 or a little over 1,000 here that can be blocked. If I select all of these, in my top navigation here, I have this button for block. So now those are all blocked. Here's the 24 remaining here, again, that are the Microsoft services. And I could still set these up in the different buckets, maybe some in business and some in non-business so that they can't work together. Another practice that a lot of our customers do is setting a default group. So these connectors are constantly coming out, where when new connectors come out, you can basically set them to default into the blocked bucket until an administrator has had the opportunity to review that connector. It's as simple enough to do that as by clicking the Set Default Group button in the top right-hand corner and switching that then over to blocked. Now, any new connectors that get released for Power Platform will start in blocked, and administrators can then review them and move them over into the other buckets. Next, we're jumping into custom connectors. Won't spend too much time here, but you do have the ability to also set up DLP policies against custom connectors. But where I do want to jump in here is this next screen for defining scope. Now, you likely have environments out there that you don't want this very restrictive policy to apply against. And you notice by default that DLP policy is set to add to all environments. For the example I just gave, we're going to click this option for excluding certain environments and click Next. You notice I have 3 environments in my tenant here, the default environment and 2 other production environments. Now, for these production environments, I do need to use those connectors. They are being handled by administrators, and we trust that we don't have any issues with data loss or data exfiltration. So I'm going to select those 2, and I'm going to click Add to Policy at the top. Now you know that this very restrictive policy we just created is going to apply to the default environment, but the 2 production environments that we're working in are excluded from this policy. I click Next at the bottom here. I review the details, and it's as simple enough as clicking this Create Policy button at the bottom to apply that new data loss prevention policy across the entire default environment. Now, we've covered quite a bit here in terms of steps to configure securing the default environment. Ben, let's pass it over to you to talk to us about securing our tenant.
Thanks, Anthony. Now that we've had a chance to take a look at how we can secure the default environment, let's take a look at some settings we can apply across our entire tenant. So this is a list of some basic steps you can take, some basic configurations you can do to limit capabilities across the entire Power Platform tenant. So these are not environment-specific settings. The first one we have listed there concerns emails. You can utilize exchange transport rules to limit the ability for the Power Platform to send messages. The second one there has to do with the ability to share apps with everyone. Using PowerShell, you can limit that capability, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. There's a feature of the Power Platform called the Gateway, the on-premises gateway. This allows you to interact with resources that are stored on premises. Well, within the Power Platform, you can limit the ability to utilize that solution to really install that gateway. Within the Power Platform, you can have communication that happens between tenants. So within one tenant, you can build a connector that connects to data in another tenant to share back and forth. You can limit that capability using a feature called tenant isolation. We talked about the LP policies, but we can go deeper than just limiting which connectors are available. We can configure which endpoints connectors can connect to, and we can configure which actions those connectors can take. We'll take a look at those. And finally, there are analytics available for the Power Platform across the entire tenant. We'll jump in and take a look at those as well, those reports. So many Exchange administrators are aware that they can use Exchange rules to limit what can be done within Exchange, really, right? The Power Platform puts information in the header of emails that allow it to be identified. And then you can create rules in Exchange that take advantage of that information. And I have some examples on the screen here for you. So, if there's concern within the organization about messages going out, emails going out from the Power Platform, utilizing the information that's put into the header of the email, you can really use your Exchange rules to limit that capability. The next one we want to talk about is the concept of sharing an app with everyone. By default, when you go into an app and you're like, hey, I want to share my app. I built it. It's great. There's a feature or an option that you can share it with everyone. So you can turn this feature off within the Power Platform using PowerShell within the Power Platform. You can use this commandlet that's at the bottom of the screen here, and this will limit or prevent users from sharing an app with everyone. Next, we're going to jump in and do a little live demoing to take a look at a few more of the changes that you can make. So right now, where I'm at is I'm in the Power Platform Administration Center. And what I did is I navigated in our navigation panel over here down to Data. And I am going to select the second tab here called the On-Premises Data Gateway. So in the Power Platform, you have this feature called the On-Premises Data Gateway, where you can install an application on-premise, on a machine, on a server, that allows for the Power Platform in the cloud to go through that gateway and connect and interact with resources on premises. This can be great. It can be really powerful. It can really extend your internal environment to the cloud for Power Apps, and it can be really powerful. However, sometimes you might want to say, do we really want anybody to be able to set up that gateway and then expose those on internal resources out through, through a Power App? Maybe, maybe not, right? It's a choice for you. But you have the option here, if you come to this tab where you can see your available on-premise gateways. I have one in just my demo environment here. But over on the right, if you look, there's the ability to turn on tenant administration for gateways. So you turn that feature on, and as soon as you do, you get this new option here to manage gateway installers. So right there, bam. So if we click that, what we can do is we can turn this on. By turning that on, we prevent everyone and anyone from installing the gateway. And then, what we have the ability to do here is we can look up a user, and I'm going to add Jim back in there, in our environment and select them. And now I add them, and now that one user can install the gateway, but nobody else can install the gateway, right? So this feature right here really turns the ability for everyone to install the gateway off, turns that off, and then allows you to manually add folks in that do have that ability to install that gateway. So another option here you might want to look at, another step that's an easy step you can take to really lock down your tenant. This is across the entire tenant, not just for any one specific environment. So the next thing we want to talk about is this feature called tenant isolation. So you may know, if you've been playing around at all with the Power Platform, that when you go to use a connector for the first time, it has you log in. Like it says, hey, okay, you want to use, like you say, I want to use the SharePoint connector, and it says, great, log in to SharePoint. Log in with your credentials, right? And that's what allows you to connect to SharePoint and pull data into your app or into your flow or into whatever, right? Whatever you're building in the system. Well, there's nothing stopping you from using credentials from another tenant. So if when I go to build that connector and I build a connection, I could put credentials in there from another tenant and pull data into this tenant from that tenant, or vice versa. If I'm in another tenant, I could log into this tenant and pull data and move it to that tenant. So this might be something you want to restrict. That a feature we can turn on called tenant isolation. Here's how it works. Again, just kind of navigating into Power Platform, we go to under policies, we go down to tenant isolation, and we can see that we have the ability to turn on tenant isolation right here. If we turn this on, what this does is this instantly prevents anyone from logging into this tenant and pulling data from it to others. It also prevents us in this tenant from reaching out to others and bringing data into this tenant, right? So this turns that off completely. Now, there's a reason why you can do this, right? Like why you would want to do this. There's a lot of legitimate reasons why you'd want to do this. Not going to go through them all here, trying to get through an hour webinar, but we could talk in detail about that. But what you have the ability to do is create rules that would be exceptions. So you can say, hey, well, yes, I'm turning this feature on. I don't want to allow for moving of data. However, we can bring data in inbound to this tenant from this particular tenant ID or domain. So I can put the ID in here, and that would allow this functionality to happen for that one tenant, this inbound functionality, whereas for everything else it would sort of be denied. So these are exceptions that you can add once you've turned this feature on. The next thing we want to jump into is how we can dive deeper with data policies. So under the same area for policies, I'm going to go to data policies, and I'm going to open or edit this particular data policy that I have, and dive in and show you what I'm talking about. So just follow my wizard. I'm going to go to the pre-built connectors. And this is a pre-built policy that I've kind of established. And really what I want to do is dive in deeper on going beyond just putting the policy in the business, non-business, or blocked category. So I'm going to go over to business here, and I have this SQL Server here in the business category. Well, it's pretty broad, right? Like, hey, you can use the SQL Server connector for business. Well, that means like you can use it for like anything, right? So can we limit that? Can we limit it to certain endpoints? Can we secure what someone might be able to do with that SQL connector? And the answer is yes. So clicking on our three dots here for more actions, we can configure this connector, and we can configure two things. We can configure endpoints and we can configure actions. Let's take a look at endpoints first. So here's our endpoint configurator. You can see by default, all endpoints are allowed. Well, I might want to say, no, I've built a specific endpoint. Maybe it's for a dev kind of scenario, and it's called like the dev endpoint or something, right? So I'm going to say, actually, we're going to allow this particular endpoint, dev, just call it that for now, and we're going to block or deny all others. So now we are writing a rule that allows only dev endpoint to be connected through SQL and denies all others. And then, of course, you could follow this by adding manually each endpoint that you might want to be able to enable for this particular policy. So let's jump into look at actions next. So if we go again, just on those little more actions, configure connector, configure actions. These are all the things that this connector has the ability to do. So for example, it can delete rows, it can execute SQL queries, it can execute stored procedures, get rows, so forth and so on. You can see them. Um, well, you might want to limit some of this. Like maybe you don't want to allow for rows to be deleted using the connector. And actually something we commonly see with SQL Server is that you really can't, you actually aren't allowed to connect to the database directly. You have to only connect to stored procedures that are built out there, maybe by IT for people to be able to consume. And that's fine too. You can go right into this connector. We could turn them all off and only leave on the stored procedures if we want. And then we can click Save. Now, before we do, of course, there's one more thing to kind of note. The Power Platform is cloud, and there's always and regularly and changes being made and new additions of features going into the environment, including potentially a different actions that might become available for SQL Server. So, do you want to allow new connector actions when they become added automatically, or do you want to block new connector actions automatically when they get added until you manually add them in? Likely in sort of a scenario that we were just sort of talking about where you can only execute stored procedures, we would want to block those new connector actions and we would save this. That then would be applied to this particular policy, and we would be really limiting the exposure of what that SQL Server can do within this policy across all environments where it's applied. So the last one that I want to kind of dive in here and talk to you about during this section, is looking at the settings and turning on the ability for analytics to take place across the tenant. So we looked at this previously in the earlier section, but if you look here under your Power Platform settings, under the settings that you can do for the whole tenant, down here there is this one for analytics. If you look at this, you have the ability to enable analytics for your tenant. So you can enable analytics for your tenant. By doing so, you enable the environment to start collecting analytics across the whole tenant. So when you go over to analytics here and you go to something, I already pulled up the Power Automate one, so we'll just jump over to that. What we have the ability here is to have analytics on this overview tab that go across the entire tenant. Next, we want to take a look at environment strategies and how you can implement an environment strategy and what components exist to help you implement an environment strategy to manage your overall Power Platform environment. Managing or implementing an environment strategy is something that is going to be specifically designed for each organization. So you'll have to make decisions on whether you want to take a more centralized or decentralized approach to managing the Power Platform or to implementing your governance strategy. So we want to take a look at the administrative levels that are going to allow you to implement that plan. We want to take a look at the types of environments that you may build and how they may work together in your strategy. Now, we've already talked about some tenant level roles within the Power Platform. We know our tenant has a global admin. We talked already about how we can create a Power Platform admin. And we know there's also a D365 admin. And these allow for management of the Power Platform across the entire tenant. However, specific to an environment, you have roles that allow an individual to be an administrator of that one specific environment. We call this the environment admin or system admin role. Again, it's important to note that this person does not have that same permission across other Power Platform environments. It's not a tenant level role, it's specific to one environment. There's also a role called System Customizer, which allows a person to interact and build things, including and most importantly, Dataverse things with this particular role in that one specific environment. There's also an environment maker role. This role lets you create apps and flows and share those apps and flows out within an environment. It's this role that everyone has in that default environment. In addition to that, inside of your environment, you can create custom roles to specific Dataverse tables. When you're creating an environment, there are several types that you can choose from to put your plan together. First, and we know already, we've talked about it, the default environment. It's auto-created. Everyone has one. Everyone's in there as a user, and everyone has that environment maker access to that default environment. Then we have an environment type called production. These are used for permanent work in an organization. They're recommended for high availability or work that your organization depends on. Production environments can be created in the system, and they can be created by licensed users, and really required in terms of utilizing the Power Platform. You then have a couple of other types of environments you can create that can help you in your development process. There are sandbox environments. These are environments that are designed to be not production, but are designed to be used for development and for testing type purposes. Sandboxes have a feature available to them where they can be created from a copy of a production environment. So you can create a copy of a production environment as a sandbox. There are trial environments. These are 30-day trial environments that allow you to test and use features of the Power Platform that perhaps you aren't licensed to be able to use. And there are developer environments. Users who have a developer plan can create developer environments for themselves. These are designed to be personal environments where one user is kind of putting together an app or building something or learning how to utilize features and functions within the Power Platform. So I wanted to take a minute and put this all together a little bit. Okay. So perhaps you in your world today are sitting there where you have a default environment, and perhaps everything is happening in that default environment today. Again, on the left-hand side, you can see represented with that icon, all of your users are in that environment. And on the right side of that icon, you can see all of your makers inside of that environment. We've talked a lot about securing this environment. We've talked about how you can use DLP policies to do that. We talked about how this environment is really designed to be for personal productivity. Likely, you may be thinking we would create this environment with the most restrictive DLP policies and really limit what can be done by all of our users in this environment, as all of them are makers. And that's true. This is, of course, of the environment type default that we went through on the previous slide. Now, as we kind of build this out, we may create a separate environment that is of a type production that we call our maker environment, or maybe it's our power user environment. This environment might be a little bit less restrictive with DLP policies. Likely in this environment, again, everyone would be a user. We can see kind of on the left-hand side, everyone's still a user in this environment, but we really limit who can make stuff in this environment. We turn on a couple additional DLP policies. Maybe to become a maker in here, you have to have a specific role within the organization, or maybe you have to pass some training that we would put together for our users that would then allow them to be makers in this particular environment. So a little less restrictive, but still designed for having a broad set of audience in the decentralized sort of approach in here, creating apps for everyone in the company to consume. Now, often after you kind of consider this, you're going to uncover that certain use cases, perhaps, that are in this environment are enterprise class. They are enterprise, and you define them that way for various reasons. Maybe a lot of users use it. Maybe it's the type of data that it wants to interact with. But for some reason, you've defined that this is enterprise data, that this application is enterprise, and perhaps it shouldn't be in this default environment or maker environment. It needs to be more in a stacked environment that's controlled by IT with proper ALM policies and procedures and things along those lines. So that's where we would come in over here with potentially, identifying something that gets created in this maker environment and move it into our enterprise stack where we have our dev, test, and production environments where very limited people can build, and people only have access to these applications if they are granted access to use one of those enterprise applications. This is where likely ALM would come into your strategy. We have a whole nother webinar covering ALM that you can, that you can partake in. We're not going to dive into ALM today, but you may have this concept where you have a sandbox environment for your dev at the enterprise level, a sandbox environment for your test at the enterprise level, and a production environment for your enterprise production apps. Now, sometimes you're going to want to be able to build an application. And to build that application, you'll put together a small dev team. Well, for that, you might spin up a specific development environment for that project, where a handful of users can come into play and come in here and build out an application. This could be a developer environment or a sandbox environment. Now, the thing here, and why you might not just do your dev straight in the enterprise apps dev environment that we see on the left-hand side, is perhaps you want to assemble a unique group of users to build this out. Maybe it is a handful of your IT dev resources, as well as a handful of makers who are going to collectively build this enterprise application. So you stand up a temporary project development environment where the app is developed, the small team has access to it, and when ready, you would use your ALM processes to move that solution over into your enterprise stack. Now, sometimes we also uncover in this area here, when we're talking about a project development environment, that the application we're building has unique requirements in terms of security and data needs to be isolated, or maybe it's has use in just a specific geography and really doesn't belong in our enterprise stack. When that happens, we have the ability to also stand up a stack for just that specific application, or just that specific region, or just that specific set of use cases or group or whatever it might be. Really have a lot of freedom to decide how that makes sense for your organization. But you would make a choice here if an app belongs in a specific stack that's isolated with different users, different security, different database completely, or if it belongs in that enterprise stack with a series of applications that make sense to support across your business. And again, this here is just a sample of how you might kind of go through and look at implementing a strategy for for managing environments in the system and the types of environments you might use for certain, but really wanted to provide this to just help you get thinking about that as you look at implementing your strategy. Next, we'll go over to Tom, who's going to talk a little bit more about the COE toolkit and about further implementing your strategy.
Managed environments are a set of features that enable admins to manage and govern Power Platform at scale with more control, less effort, and more insight. With managed environments, admins can limit the sharing of Canvas apps, get weekly usage insights, apply data policies to restrict the connectors available, and set up pipelines for application lifecycle management. Managed environments can be enabled, disabled, and edited in the Power Platform Admin Center or using PowerShell. The scrolling image on the right shows the available options to select when a managed environment is enabled. We'll discuss each in more detail. Limit sharing allows admins to control how widely makers can share their low-code Canvas apps and solution-aware cloud flows. By using limit sharing, admins can prevent uncertified apps from getting overexposed and ensure compliance with organizational policies. Admins can set different rules for sharing, such as excluding sharing with security groups, limiting the number of individuals who can be shared with, or prevent sharing with everyone in the tenant. In the maker experience shown on the right, the maker has attempted to share the app with Christine and is blocked from doing so due to the limit of 3 users specified in the admin experience on the left. By using solution checker enforcement, admins can require solutions to pass a set of best practice rules and identify problematic patterns before they can be imported In the admin experience on the left, different modes are set for solution checker enforcement: none, warn, or block, depending on preference and policies. Solution checker must be run on the solution before it can be imported in the Maker portal, and the results must be within a 90-day window and without any exclusions or overrides. Usage Digest is a weekly email that provides a summary of the usage, errors, and popularity of apps and flows. Items 1, 2, and 3 are the sections of this digest. As illustrated in the admin experience, admins enable or disable the digest on each managed environment and add the appropriate recipients. Maker welcome content allows admins to provide customized welcome content and URL to help their makers get started with Power Apps. As shown in the Maker experience for Contoso on the right, the custom help content replaces the default Power Apps first-time help experience for makers. Pipelines are used to manage and automate the deployment of solution packages between different Power Platform environments. Pictured here is a common process where development of a solution is performed in a dev environment, testing and validation in a test environment, and final rollout to a production environment. Pipelines can automate this process, and Power Platform managed environments provide an app that you can use to configure, run, and manage your pipelines. Let's take a look. In the Power Platform Admin Center, I'm using 4 environments shown here. The COE environment is the host for the pipeline app and configurations. The dev environment is where I build my app. Test is the environment where users test the app. And prod is the production environment for the app. Note that all 4 environments are marked as managed, a prerequisite for using pipelines. In the apps list for my COE host environment is the pipeline configuration app that was installed from the Power Platform Admin Center resources list. The deployment pipeline configuration app is a model-driven app that is used to build pipelines and connect them to the appropriate environments. It also tracks and reports history on pipelines that have been executed. A pipeline has 1 or more deployment stages, with each deployment stage connected to the appropriate environment. As you can see, I have a deployment stage from dev to test and a deployment stage from test to prod. Note that the test to prod stage has a dependent dev to test stage. This ensures the life cycle of the solution must progress from dev to test and then from test to prod. Next, let's look at an equipment checkout solution that I'm building in my dev environment. This solution contains a Canvas app and a flow and is ready to promote to the next environment. When I select pipelines, the main deployment pipeline that was previously configured and is selected, and can manage the deployment of my solution to test and prod. Note that when I select the Test Deploy button, the source is dev and the target is test. When I select the Deploy button for production, the source is test and the target is prod. This ensures that the exact same solution package that was validated in test is deployed to prod. Finally, notice that versioning is being tracked as well. Version 3 of my solution is currently in dev. Version 2 has been deployed to test, and version 1 is active in prod. Once testing and validation are complete in test, deploying to prod will deploy version 2. Finally, a full run history of the deployments is also tracked, noting which environments were updated and which solution version and when. As I've shown, pipelines can simplify ALM for Power Platform, as well as impose appropriate guardrails for makers, admins, and developers. In summary, managed environments provide a suite of capabilities that allow admins to manage Power Platform at scale with more visibility, more control, and less effort. Now let's talk about Center of Excellence, or COE. To create a space where admins and makers can operate confidently and productively, we see many organizations establish a Center of Excellence, or a COE. A COE is a coordinating function that ensures the Power Platform strategy is aligned with the company's digital transformation strategy. Establishing a COE means nurturing organic growth while maintaining governance and control. When we talk about a Center of Excellence, we typically talk about these following participants: makers who build apps and flows at a department and/or organization level, ALM users who set up environments, manage apps, flows, and other platform services across the organization, IT department who are enterprise architects or responsible for information security, data, and service management. And finally, those who are responsible for help desk, support, training, and readiness. The Customer Advisory Team, or PowerCat, is a team of solution architects within Microsoft R&D who focus on helping customers accelerate their Microsoft Power Platform adoption. In collaboration with some of our most successful customers, the PowerCat team identified consistent themes, patterns, practices, and behaviors that reinforce the progress of successful organizations who have implemented Power Platform. The COE Starter Kit represents what we've learned from these implementations and is a collection of apps and flows that can serve as a template to implement administration and governance best practices across the enterprise. The COE Starter Kit is sourced on GitHub and maintained by the PowerCat team. aka.ms COE Starter Kit takes you to the main documentation page on Microsoft Learn. It provides guidance and instructions for installing the COE Starter Kit. The Starter Kit is comprised of building blocks and standalone add-ins. The Learn site describes each of these in detail with illustrations and instructional videos. While I do not have time to cover all these components, I'll highlight the three: governance, nurture, and communication site template that are all starred here. Admin View is a model-driven app and is used to see who apps are shared with, what roles these users have, and for apps shared with groups, the size of the group. Admin View can also assist with app audits and is one of many components that enhance the governance process. The Power BI dashboard provides a holistic overview and insights into resources in your tenant. This includes environments, apps, flows, connectors, connection references, makers, and audit logs. Telemetry from the audit log is stored from the moment you set up the COE Starter Kit, so you can look back and identify trends over time using this dashboard. The communication site template is a SharePoint site that is designed to provide you with a starting point of content and page templates as you're setting up your internal Power Platform wiki and community site. The communication site is designed to be the place where your community can find the news and resources they need, and includes digital governance and compliance guardrails. The Innovation Backlog app is used by all users across the organization to submit ideas for apps and flows that need to be built, and to describe pain points with their current processes. As users describe these processes, they can provide information about the personas involved, the tools used, and measures for improvement. This information is then used to calculate an ROI and complexity score. The most impactful ideas can be selected for your development team to build, or selected for an upcoming hackathon. Other users can vote on ideas and add their own scenarios to an existing idea. Developers can additionally request feedback and testimonials to build their portfolio. Microsoft Power Platform is a suite of low-code tools that enable users to build apps, automate workflows, and create chatbots. As we've discussed in this session, Power Platform offers a wide range of capabilities that are designed to help admins and IT pros set up, secure, manage, govern, and monitor the use and adoption of Power Platform and its components across the enterprise. The Power Platform Admin Center is the unified portal where admins manage all aspects of the Power Platform, including environments, apps, flows, connectors, data sources, data policies, and security roles. The Admin Center also provides rich analytics and insights into the usage performance, health, and quality of Power Platform assets. Managed environments are a set of features in premium Power Platform licensing that enable admins to manage and govern the Power Platform at scale with more control, less effort, and more insights. And finally, the Center of Excellence Starter Kit is a collection of templates, apps, flows, views, and dashboards that help admins implement best practices for governing the Power Platform in their organization. The COE Starter Kit helps admins monitor, nurture, and drive adoption of Power Platform and helps to enforce policies, audit apps and flows, manage makers and users, and communicate with stakeholders. On behalf of all the presenters, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to attend today's session. If you or others in your organization would like to continue building your skills on Power Platform, I encourage you to check out our Power App, Power Automate Flow, or Power Virtual Agent Bot in a Day training, whose links are provided here. We are continuously innovating Power Platform and announce these on our cloud blogs and update the online release planner. There are hundreds of thousands of active participants in our online Power Platform ecosystem who can serve as a great resource. Today's session focused on Power Platform managed environments and the COE Starter Kit, and the links to these on Microsoft Learn is provided. A link is also provided to Power Platform adoption guidance. And finally, this session is one of many that our team is conducting and will be posted for on-demand viewing. Our team is here to help, and we understand the value that Power Platform can bring to an organization. If you need any help, please reach out to your Microsoft account manager or your BizApps or low-code specialist to request a one-on-one meeting. Thank you very much.